I recently got a new channel partner, which was actually with my alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, in collaboration with Wall Street Prep. And so through Wharton Online, they're offering a few different certificates, and one of the certificates is in an area of business that I actually started my career in. So I thought maybe I could shed some more light on it in this video. This is the Financial Planning and Analysis, or FP&A certificate program. I worked in this area for about 2 years before I left it to pursue stuff more in line with the investment space. I figured maybe I have enough experience to really talk about what this field is and whether this certificate would be useful or valuable, or who might be interested in it. So let's take a look. So as with all of these Wharton online certificates, it's going to follow a 8-week structure, which is basically in cohorts where you get in a cohort with a bunch of other people all at the same time. And the approximate amount of time that they're expecting you to spend on this to basically get through it would be 10 hours per week, and the entire thing is online. So the big thing here is, how much does it cost? And so it all depends on whether you register early. So the early registration happens for each cohort by a certain date. So you might be watching this in the future when there's a different date, because there's basically 3 cohorts per year. So if you make it in before the early registration, you save the $200, plus you can use my code Ryan to save $300. So if you sign up and you use the code before that early registration, you can save a total of basically $500. Or total price would be $5,000. So the cheapest you can get it to is the $4,500. Now let's talk about what are some of the advantages that I see with it. So if you're trying to break into a career in FP&A, or you already work in FP&A but you want to advance, then it could be good to have something on your resume which could signal some level of, prestige. So with this is through the University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League institution, and through Wharton, in particular Wharton Online, which carries a lot of name recognition. Now, I would say one thing that would drive that name recognition and that prestige would be the exclusivity of the university. But with certificates like this, it's not like an application where you have to basically apply against a bunch of other people and they only accept a small percentage, or definitely gets rid of that exclusivity aspect of it. But the other thing is, not everyone really knows which certificates and stuff through Wharton carry that exclusivity. So I think you can benefit from having that brand on your resume anyways. Now let's take a look at who might be interested in this type of program. So they're basically putting 8 applicant profiles that would be targeted for these cohorts. And so they're saying FP&A analysts and managers. So to me, this is the most obvious one. If let's say you want to break into the FP&A field as an analyst, or maybe you're already an analyst and you want to get to a manager, or you're a middle manager and you want to get to a senior manager or something like that. So also, it could be good for accountants. So when I worked in FP&A worked really closely with the accountants and the controllers. So especially for an accountant that maybe wants to break more over into the FP&A area, this could be something that could be valuable for them. And then definitely students that want to break into FP&A or get an FP&A internship, or someone who wants to switch their career into FP&A. Now for, non-finance professionals or people who don't want to work in the space, I'm not sure I would target certification like this. And then I could see some value in the certificate for people in other areas who just need to be able to understand the FP&A space better, C-level executives often need to take their information from FP&A people, so that could maybe help them speak their language a bit more. Same with consultants. Now let's take a look at a breakdown of a past cohort. Okay, so it looks like they've got about 350 students per cohort and 40 countries represented. And most of the people, a little over half, are going to basically be early career from 18 to 29. And it looks like 83% of the people are under the age of 40, which is, what you would expect, because I would think most people would be getting this because they are looking to advance in their earlier mid-career. And then this profile makes sense to me. Most people just being in FP&A or accounting, and then some people kind of being in related fields. treasury. I think there's a big overlap oftentimes between treasury and FP&A in corporations. One thing that could be useful is that it's self-paced and online. So basically, if you can't do like a certain week or something, then you can basically skip this week and then do double the stuff the next week. And then if you want the in-person events, they have those. From what I heard, that they get together afterwards in New York if everyone's invited who did it and everyone networks and stuff. And then for me, this is probably the biggest thing to me would be just like something that you can put on your resume that has like that Wharton brand name on it. Now let's walk through the curriculum, and I'm going to try to connect this to when I worked in FP&A for like 2 years to see if it overlaps with some of the stuff that I was doing. So let's see, this is basically, there's going to be like these 8 modules. So each module is going to represent one of the 8 weeks. So starting off, examination of forecasts, budgets, variance analysis, scorecards, dashboards, and management decks. Yeah, so this makes sense. Like a big part of financial planning and analysis is the forecasting part, where basically you're saying like in this month we expect this many sales or this much cost, and you break it into each category, and then you'll set budgets for each different department where they can basically have like this much headcount and spend this much on each employee and stuff like that. And then at the end of each month and each quarter and each year, you do a variance analysis where you compare what you had basically forecasted and budgeted to what actually happened. And then for the biggest deviations, you basically are going to have to explain to the people like up the ladder from you. And then building out these like scorecards and dashboards, you're basically trying to make tools that like people higher up, like the executives or vice president level people, can take a look at and get like a really quick view of how is everything looking with this particular business line or this source of revenue or something. And a big part of it was making decks for management, where like every month you'd have like this specific deck that shows these specific things due on this specific day of that month, business day 6 or something. And then a big part of the job would just be like updating the same decks with the new month's numbers or the new quarter's numbers. Then we have understanding FP&A's tools of the trade, including Excel. Excel was the number one tool that I used when I was working in FP&A by far. So data analysis, which can be done in Excel or other softwares or other even programming languages like Python or SQL. Visualization software, so this could be any number of softwares. They might use like Tableau or Power BI or something like that. And emerging AI technologies. That's interesting because I was working in this space back from like 2017 to like, early part of 2019. And so there was really no such thing as AI technologies in this space at that time. Introduction to strategic cost accounting in the context of FP&A. I really hated the work I did in cost accounting. So then week 2 gets into the planning cycle and annual budgeting. I remember this being a big thing back when I was in FP&A. Like you'd spend the last couple months of the calendar year doing this whole planning cycle and annual budgeting, and it would get really busy. So here we see an in-depth review of planning process, including a long-range planning and annual budgeting, best practices for top-down and bottom-up planning jointly with cross-functional team. So back when I was in FP&A, I remember we had to meet with like the people who ran different departments and sit down with them and figure out what was going to be like their annual budget for the next year. And they'd like say information about like how much headcount they needed and try to like justify that headcount. And then we'd have to come up with some sort of like annual budget for how much money could be allocated to this specific department or this specific team. And then everything was done basically in Excel, where we'd have like different sheets for different teams basically trying to figure out what their total budget was for the next year. And now week 3 gets into forecasting. So maybe I'll talk about this from the perspective of the place that I used to work. So, this was the only company that I ever worked at after college that wasn't purely a financial institution. So this was actually like a heating, ventilation, and air conditioning company, like a really large one. And so one of the forecasting things was you had to try to figure out how many, let's say like units of this air conditioning machine or how many units of this heating system were going to be sold basically in like January, February, March, April of this year. And you had to use like different techniques, including, let's say, because it's hotter in these months, they often sell more like air conditioners, or because it's cooler in these months, they often sell more heating units or something. Then you have to take into effect this seasonality. And then you're going to be beholden to the forecast that you make, because remember back when we were talking about up here, like this variance analysis, that you'll have to, at the end of each month, see how many of each one did they actually sell. How did it compare to what was forecasted to be sold? And then the more off it is, the worse the forecast was that was made by the FP&A analyst or manager. Next, we have using scenario planning to identify risks and opportunities and develop mitigation plans. So sticking with my example, maybe one scenario you could have is with some adverse weather effects where the weather is abnormal for 1 month beyond what it would typically be, then that would cause you to sell less units than you might otherwise have normally sold. So that would be a risk that needs to be identified and to develop a mitigation plan in case that occurs. And then finally, improving forecast accuracy by identifying and addressing forecast bias. So basically looking at how did your forecast end up performing? Was it accurate? If not, why did it not perform well? Was there a bias? Now let's address that. And now into week 4, we get into financial analysis in FP&A. So I'm thinking this is going to be more of like the Excel stuff, the data stuff. So best practices for data preparation and quality. So this would be a useful thing to learn, like whether you work in FP&A or any other area of finance. If you're going to be working with data and Excel, learning those best practices, I think, is super important. Learn how to identify cost savings, risks, and opportunities, and then create variance analysis commentary that uncovers actionable insights. Now, we kind of covered a lot of what we were saying about this before, but basically, we started off with some sort of forecast or some budget. Then the period of time actually happened. Now we have the actuals or the real results, compare them to what we thought would happen, and then figure out why were we wrong or why were we right? And then based on these deviations, maybe there's something that we can take away for the future. Now in week 5, it gets into financial modeling for decision support. So let's look at some of these things. Excel modeling standards and best practices. So I guess this is going to be more general Excel modeling, which is always super useful. And big thing that I do on my channel, if you're interested in Excel modeling videos. Financial statement and DCF modeling. So this is going to be like income statement, balance sheet, statement of cash flows, and then this is discounted cash flow modeling. So you're trying to come up with some sort of present value. It looks like a lot of this is going to be trying to value projects. So payback is like, how long does it take for you to get your money back that you invested in the first place? Return on your investment is like, that's quite obvious, right? What percentage return did we get on this money we invested? Lifetime value is like, how much is the life value of a specific customer? If we get this customer to buy our air conditioning machines for their whole life, what is the present value of this customer being a lifetime customer of ours? We want to put a number on that. And then some break-even analysis and getting to answers without modeling. So the break-even analysis is like, how many units sold or at how much revenue does this project finally break even? That's the number we need to get to make sure that we don't lose money on this investment. Now we'll move on to week 6, finance business partnering. Developing a broad understanding of the business. That is one thing that I liked about FP&A, is I always felt like FP&A was a super like bird's eye view of the corporation. But it depends on what FP&A team you work in. So there can be FP&A teams that are like really specific, where they work on this specific business line and they are super hyper focused on that, and they generate all these reports that will eventually flow up higher into like a more consolidating function of the corporation. But there are functions that actually like consolidate from the lower levels. So I used to work in that space for like about a year, and that was interesting because you're getting all the reports from all the different tiny parts of the corporation, and then you're seeing literally like everything, what's going on with each specific business line. So then that way you do develop a really broad understanding of the business. Building trust and holding people accountable while maintaining relationships. Yeah, so, well, you basically need to get data from different teams And so you'll want to have good relationships with those people so that they can send you the stuff that you need. But then also holding people accountable comes in when like certain people might have had certain expectations on them. They're going to sell this many units or they're going to generate this much revenue, and then they don't do that. And then you have to go and say, why did this function not perform the way that it was forecasted to or expected? And they might end up giving you a whole bunch of excuses. Then finally, influencing skills and challenging assumptions with data. So it seems like a big part of this whole week is just like the psychological or personal aspect of influencing people and maintaining relationships, building trust, stuff like that. And then in week 7, reporting, presenting, and storytelling. Yeah, storytelling was a big part of the role because basically there's people that are like higher levels up, like the CFO or maybe people like one level below the CFO that are waiting on data and information from the FP&A teams, and they need a story to be told of like what happened last month, and they're going to have a bunch of questions on that. So we see structuring, management, reporting decks that move the needle. So basically when my job was like a whole bunch of it was literally just making a bunch of reports that happened at specific business days each month that would go to certain levels of management that just basically consolidated what was happening in the corporation. And then theoretically, they should be making decisions based on the data that they're seeing from those reports. Matching visualizations to the story behind the numbers. So you're going to have to make graphs that are going to show clearly like the story that you're trying to tell with the data. And then impacting strategic decisions through effective financial presentations. So I think this would be like once you're higher up in FP&A, that basically based on the numbers or the data that you're seeing, what would you suggest to someone in leadership for their strategic decisions based on what the data is telling you? And then finally, we see preparing for the future of FP&A. So how is AI changing the FP&A function? This is like the ultimate module that should be included in like every course for anything right now, because to me, that's like the biggest question is how is AI going to change all of these things? I'm kind of wondering that about basically every single finance role, not just FP&A. But FP&A, I feel like, is especially one that I'm curious because it's like really rules-based, in my opinion, because it's so closely related to accounting, which is really rules-based. And one thing where AI is really effective is with rules-based systems. So I'm curious. Introduction to generative AI in finance and machine learning. And okay, so one thing I remember about working in FP&A was it felt like a lot of this stuff was really repetitive. Like it's the same things that happen each month. And if you like to like fall into a similar monthly routine, you might be the type of person that would like working in FP&A. But when things are really like routine, I always wonder about what room is there to automate some of this stuff and basically come up with some AI or some software model that's going to do the thing that the human used to be doing. And so I always kind of thought that like FP&A was sort of like more of an area that was ripe for automation, at least when I worked in it, and that's the company specifically that I had worked at. And then finally, FP&A interview preparation. That's probably the number one most important thing because I feel like the whole reason to do this program in the first place is to get a job in FP&A or advance a career in FP&A. And then they actually did have like a lot of people who had like pretty impressive roles at like bigger companies, like a couple CFOs, a couple people you may have been familiar with. But anyways, if you're interested in looking more into it, I'm going to put a link to this program in the description of this video and into a pinned comment underneath the video. And also remember to use the code Ryan for $300 off. Plus you can get the additional $200 off if you apply before the early enrollment period is over.